Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. My name is Heather Conley, Director of our Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program here at CSIS. We are delighted to be in partnership with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung to bring you a new three-part series that examines German Chancellor Angela Merkel's legacy. Of course, she's still Chancellor until the parliament elections occur in the fall, but this is an incredible opportunity to reflect back on an extraordinary 16-year tenure as German Chancellor. This first series is an examination of her leadership, both within Germany, within Europe, and the transatlantic relationship. Before I begin and introduce our two discussants, let me welcome Paul Lennartz, who is the Executive Director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's North American office. Paul, let me turn to you for a few words of welcome, and then we will get started.
Heather, thank you so much. Good morning to our viewers in the US. Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and Europe and perhaps beyond. Very warm welcome from my side. According to the agenda, I was actually supposed to deliver the closing remarks this way. I'm able to express my sincere gratitude to CSIS already right at the beginning for its invaluable support and close cooperation. A very warm welcome also from my side to our distinguished panelists, Jürgen Hart, member of the German Bundestag and foreign policy spokesperson of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group, and Majid Sattar, Washington correspondent of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Heather is going to introduce our distinguished panelists, will lead us through the discussion. So from here, Heather, the floor is yours.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. And absolutely, you did a great job of already introducing Jürgen and Majid, but let me begin with introducing Jürgen Hart. Jürgen has been a member of the Bundestag since 2009, but from 2014 to 2018, Jürgen Hart served as the government's coordinator of transatlantic cooperation, a role that we had the great pleasure of engaging in a lot of great discussions with Jürgen during his tenure. And as Paul mentioned, Jürgen now serves as the foreign policy spokesperson of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group, where he is responsible for clarifying the party's foreign policy objectives. He also is a deputy on the Committee for Affairs of the European Union and Defense Committee. And we also are delighted to welcome Majid Sattar, the political U.S. correspondent for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Prior to Majid's posting here in Washington, for 8 years, he served as the Berlin correspondent, where he followed both Chancellor Merkel and the German Foreign Office in foreign policy issues for over 8 years, from 2010 to 2018. So both Jürgen and Majid are incredible students of foreign policy and watching the evolution of German foreign policy. But we're going to talk some politics today. But of course, all politics, domestic politics and foreign policy definitely work together these days. So welcome to you both. And Jürgen, let me turn to you first. We're talking about leadership, and of course, we just witnessed a new leader of the party of CDU on January 16th. Armin Laschet, the premier of North Rhine-Westphalia, was named the new Secretary General of the party. Help our audience understand the importance of that election, and what does it mean about Angela Merkel's legacy? Premier Laschet is a centrist. Angela Merkel is a centrist. Has that meant that centrism has won, and that's her legacy, and that will continue in the future? Welcome.
I just would like to answer when I'm allowed. I think in Germany, the party chairman of the party who is running a majority in the parliament after an election is normally also the person who might be elected as a chancellor, head of the government. In the CDU-CSU group, it's a little bit different because we have two parties, the Bavarian CSU party, which is very successful in Bavaria, and the CDU. And though we have two chairmen, we have Markus Söder, the Prime Minister of Bavaria, who is the chairman of the CSU, and Armin Laschet, the Prime Minister of North Rhine-Westphalia, now newly elected chair of the CDU. First, I would like to mention that I think that the 1,001 delegates who were allowed to vote for the party chairman of CDU 3 weeks ago had in mind that the party chairman of CDU has to convince people from all groups of the society of politics of CDU and maybe also of its capabilities as potential chancellor. And looking to the three respective names, Norbert Röttgen, I appreciate Norbert Röttgen very much. I sit close to him in the group meetings always, and he's the chair of our Foreign Affairs Committee, and also Friedrich Merz. I think most of the delegates thought that potentially Armin Laschet has the easiest way to present politics, our politics, not only to elites or scientists and CEOs, but also to the housewives in North Rhine-Westphalia, in the Ruhrgebiet or elsewhere, in the wide and broad range. And the second was Armin Laschet won a big election, the election in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is 1/4 of the whole Federal Republic of Germany, and therefore gave a proof for its quality as a campaign leader. And at the end, I think the third was that also Angela Merkel, from my point of view, was in favor of Armin Laschet as a potential successor. And this, she didn't announce it, but looking to her politics and that what Armin is presenting in politics, it is obvious that Armin is the closest to the politics of Angela Merkel at that time. These 3 points together might be the reason for why we elected him, me too. It was a close race in the second round because we had 3 candidates, but I appreciate that also the 2 others signaled that they will strongly support Armin Laschet, whatever happened in the next months. Germany and the CDU-CSU will take the decision who might run as candidate for chancellorship in March, I expect, after the 2 state elections in Baden-Württemberg and Rheinland-Pfalz, which are a little bit a proof for how it works. And from my point of view, it will be Armin Laschet or Markus Söder. In principle, it would be also possible for another one. Some people name Jens Spahn, the Minister on Health, very popular at the moment in Germany. But I think one of the 2 party leaders will do the race.
Jürgen, thank you so much. We're going to unpack a lot of the content that you just provided. Thank you so much. Maciej, let me turn to you because in some ways, during the CDU party convention, foreign policy was a little bit on the conversation. You had the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Norbert Röttgen. He was, I think, suggesting a much tougher policy on China, certainly on Russia. There's a lively debate within Germany on this framing of that. He ran a very dynamic candidacy. I think he originally, as he entered it, weren't too sure what that meant, but he ran a very good race, I think. Of course, Mr. Merz was always a challenger to Chancellor Merkel and challenged her centrism, that the CDU needed to return more to its conservative roots, re-identify itself. Do you think this is settled now, in your view, after the party convention? We don't know the ultimate chancellor candidate, and we'll talk about that in a second. But what were your reflections on the party convention, the results, and what it means?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation and also the kind introduction. I think, and I agree with Jürgen Hart totally, the solution which was found at the party convention is, from Merkel's perspective, the perfect solution, because it is not perceived, and it is also not a break with her legacy, with her policies. especially in terms of European and foreign policy. Merz would have been perceived as a break. The whole issue of the refugee crisis that estranged Merkel to the right wing of her party would have been reevaluated. I think there were some exaggerations. He was portrayed as the German version of Donald Trump. I think that was unfair, but it would have been a re-evaluation of Merkel's immigration policy. With Röttgen, it would have been different. He used to be a close ally of Angela Merkel, then they had some difficulties. And you stated correctly that his Russia and his China policy approach differ from Merkel's. So I think she's very happy to see that Armin Laschet is in a way guaranteeing a continuation of a very balanced approach. Yet I think one problem remains, especially if Laschet is going to be the candidate for chancellorship, and eventually they will form a coalition with the Green Party. The whole issue surrounding Nord Stream will be a conflict, because the Green Party is very strict and different from the Social Democrats currently in terms of the German gas policy towards Russia. They do not like Nord Stream 2. They want to get rid of the pipeline, and that's going to remain a conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll talk about sort of those potential coalition talks, which would be very difficult. But let me turn, Jürgen, to you, and let me just unpack a little bit. Let's talk about the road to the decision of who the candidate will be for CDU-CSU. You mentioned that we have 2 Länder elections in mid-March, Baden-Württemberg, which of course is the perfect example of a black-green coalition. Both parties are almost equal, if I saw recent polling correctly. And of course, Rhineland-Palatinate is the grand coalition of the CDU and SPD, which is in charge of that Länder. What are you looking for in those results? And then I guess I'll have to just put you on the spot. Can you give us a sense of how you think who the next the chancellor candidate will be? This would be, of course, if it is Markus Söder from CSU, this would be the 3rd time a CSU candidate has been put forward, but of course has been unsuccessful thus far. So I'd welcome your thoughts on helping us understand the Länder elections and then the ultimate selection of who the candidate will be for the parliament elections.
The Länder elections in Germany are different. Looking to that, what is the actual government in Baden-Württemberg? It's not, I don't want to correct you, but it's not black-green, it's green-black, which is totally, it's different, because the prime minister in this case is from the Green Party and the CDU is only number 2, and the attempt is to change that, to make the lady running for the prime minister's office in the CDU the prime minister, and the Greens potentially the opposite. And in Rhineland-Palatinate, we have the Liberals in a coalition also with a woman from the Social Democrats, which is also different to that what normally the Liberals try to present, like in North Rhine-Westphalia, for example, where we have a coalition, the Liberals with the CDU. This shows that depending on the special circumstances in the states, you cannot mirror the results and politic behavior in the states, in the several Länder on a federal level. I think in these crucial times of Corona, the prime ministers, if they do not fail with their action as governing a state, a Länder, they have a good chance to also to get a good result. I think it's more difficult to throw an acting prime minister from his throne in these times than it potentially is in times where people like to have more break out into new times or something like that. Therefore, I cannot give an estimation. I think the CDU in Baden-Württemberg is upcoming. In some polls, they is ahead of Greens. And also Waldorf, the candidate from the CDU in Rhineland-Palatinate, is coming closer to the prime minister. The decision on who might run for chancellor will be taken after these two elections, but I think mainly the reason for that is not to influence the Länder elections. The result will be, I expect the result will in a way that Prime Minister Armin Laschet, the chairman of the CDU, can live with the could live with the result and will not blame him. And therefore, for him, from his point of view, the way is open, but he has to take a decision. You mentioned this 2 times Christian Social Union party leaders run. It was Strauss 1980 and it was Stoiber 2002, I think. Both failed, both came below expectations. And my assessment on politics in Germany, and Angela Merkel is a very good example for that. The best you can have in politics is that you are underestimated by your concurrents. Yeah, and if you are overestimated, like potentially Franz Josef Strauss was, or also Stoiber was, the people came more and more irritated on the campaign trail that you are only a human being, also doing votes. And the other way around, that someone is coming up when Angela Merkel was my constituency. I was party chairman at that time in May 2005. And I always tell my people, if I would have told you in May 2005 that this lady besides me will be chancellor in 6 months, you will send me to a psychiatric clinic. And she was totally underestimated. And I think also Armin Laschet is a little bit underestimated because he's small from his figure, from his size. He's speaking a little bit Rhineland accent. He is not seen as a big philosopher or excellent speaker or something like that. And this is a good chance to have success in German politics if you are underestimated by your concurrents.
All right, that's a good tip for success in German politics. Majid, let me turn to you because I really want your thoughts on sort of the chancellor candidate race because it's great to speculate. But I also want to just go back one moment. What struck me about the 3 candidates for party leadership is all 3 came from North Rhine-Westphalia. That's pretty extraordinary. And of course, Chancellor Merkel's legacy is that she came from the East. And does this sort of mean, is CDU giving up a little bit on the East? We saw where AfD grew extensively in the East. This is unfortunately a Länder election. Thuringia was the downfall of the former CDU party leader. Help us understand, maybe is there an East-West dynamic here that we should be aware of as we head towards the parliament elections?
So I know that things could be perceived as a revival of the Old West against the New East. Actually, I think it is attributed to coincidence. Of course, North Rhine-Westphalia, the state where I grew up in, is the most populous state in Germany, and it's very important within the CDU. But in former times, a lot of influential politicians also came from the southwestern part of Germany, Baden-Württemberg. So that the 3 candidates, and plus the health secretary, who was at times also considered to be a potential candidate, Jens Spahn, all come from North Rhine-Westphalia, was, I think, more or less coincidence. Even though the situation for the CDU in the East has become more complicated with the rise of the AfD, of course. With regard to the candidates for chancellorship, I also agree with Jürgen Hart. I think that it is more likely that Armin Laschet will be the one. It is the traditional solution. And, historic evidence shows that it doesn't go well for Bavarian politicians, Bavarian CSU politicians. It is one thing to influence the national government from Munich, and the CSU has done a pretty good job doing that. But it's a whole different ballgame to change to Berlin and to be a national figure with your Bavarian heritage. I think Markus Söder is definitely flattered by the fact that he's perceived as a potential candidate, but I think he's also very realistic about his chances.
Well, it's going to be very exciting to watch, particularly as Jürgen noted, there could be a dark horse and the person that's sitting beside you may come forward. So I think we will watch that very closely. I'm going to just pause for a moment and encourage our audience, please send us questions through the Q&A function. I've gotten a few, as you could probably know, about Nord Stream 2. So I want to sort of shift the conversation now to the legacy of Chancellor Merkel's leadership in Europe. Maciej, I think it was you in our previous conversations that sort of coined Chancellor Merkel as the crisis manager. Certainly, she has been at the forefront of managing some of Europe's most daunting crises. I'm sure some critics would argue that she created some of those crises, and that points, Jürgen, to your note about migration, the migration challenge. But Europe turns to Chancellor Merkel and her calmness to step by step manage through these problems. Jürgen, let me turn to you. Such an important player in European foreign policy and German foreign policy. How do you think Europe, the EU, is going to manage in the post-Merkel era when they rely so much on her calmness and her strength?
Difficult to say. We always cannot imagine that after a long time of legacy of a chancellor or prime minister or president, it's difficult to judge on what might become later. My experience with Angela Merkel was nobody believed that she might ever become chancellor or might be a good chancellor. And if you ask German people in the 16th years of legacy, I think polls of outgoing chancellors never had been on that level as it is with Angela Merkel now, even not with Konrad-Adenauer. I'm not sure, but Mr. Sattar maybe can help me out. But I think looking to the polls, it's amazing. And I think if Germany stays to its politics, that we are able and willing to take over responsibility, but only if our partners, the European Union member states, agree on and ask us for doing that. I think this is the right strategy. And the first partner is to ask the French president and the Polish president if he potentially agrees on what Germany proposes in foreign policy for the European Union, and second, the Commission, and third, all the smaller states. It's also always was a factor of success for a German chancellor in European politics that he not only looks to the big countries, but also try to integrate the medium-sized and smaller European Union member states, like, for example, the Netherlands, which expect a lot of close relations to Germany. And this is hard work to do, but I think, for example, Armin Laschet, who is not yet experienced in that field, but from his mind and mood, and he's living, I think, 5 kilometers away from the Belgian and 5 kilometers away from the Netherlands border. He is someone who might be able to manage that, to make sure that Germany will lead and is able to lead, but not in conflict with our partners. And this might be the right strategy also for the next decades.
Well, I think there are growing questions regarding Mr. Laschet's views on Russia and China. Certainly, Berlin played outsized roles in determining the EU's role and relationship with both of those in US parlance, great powers, great power competition. Maciej, let me turn to you and help us understand. I think there, again, the debate amongst the candidates, even within Germany, there's some shifting positions on Russia, certainly after the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, what we've seen over the last 2 weeks in Russia, the brutality of the Russian services against peaceful protesters. We've seen, concerns about Belarus and others. Do you see, in some ways, Angela Merkel's legacy on Russia, we'll start with Russia, then I'll move to China, they're two separate things, changing? Because some view that Mr. Laschet is more sympathetic to Russia due to the strong business relations and ties between North Rhine-Westphalia and Russia. But welcome your comment on Russia, and then Jürgen, I'll come back to you on China and turn to you, Maciej, as well. On Russia, help us understand legacy and future.
So I think that there are different reasons for Armin Laschet's position. On the one hand, I think him being the governor of a Rust Belt state, North Rhine-Westphalia doesn't like to be called a Rust Belt state, but a more traditional industrial state with close ties to the Russian economy, that shapes his view. But also he's not, and neither has Merkel, of course, has been a leading, different from Röttgen, a leading foreign policy expert. And Merkel also evolved into her role. She started out as being a very cautious player on the international stage. I think looking back, the year 2011 is in a way a turning point in her chancellorship, when she realized that it was not only about getting reelected and her concern about the German public and her chances of getting reelected, which every politician does. But I think in the year 2011, with the escalating Euro crisis, she realized that her chancellorship was now more about her entry in the history book, and of course the integrity of the European Union. And I think that's when it started, that she became a bolder player on the international stage. Of course, then it was quite obvious in the Ukraine crisis, when she was taking the front seat along with the French, but the French were only in that Normandy format because they made it. They had the intention to. They wanted to be perceived as a European approach and not a German approach, but she was the one in the driver's seat, and not Hollande and not Macron, of course. And I think her relationship to Putin has changed. I mean, she inherited Schröder's policy, and she, in a way, continued his approach, especially with the gas relation. But she has become more critical of him. And that's because that is why we now perceive Armin Laschet as, in a way, a setback, because he sounds more like Schröder than like Merkel. But I think if he is going to become the chancellor, he will have to redefine his role. For one reason, his coalition partner, let's say, will be the Green Party, will force him to. And there's a second reason, I think. We now have, with the Biden presidency, a totally different political landscape. Under Trump, in a way, gave the Germans the best excuse to balance their policies towards Russia, because Trump mixed geopolitical strategies with national interest. And so it was very easy for Germany to say, look, he's trying to sell his gas, right? And that's not a legitimate perspective. With Biden, it's different. Look at Biden's foreign policy and security policy team. It is all about geopolitics. And it will be tougher for Germany to neglect that.
Thank you so much. No, and a lot of our audience questions are very focused on Nord Stream 2, very focused on the future German-Russian relationship. But I think your point about evolution is really important, and the crises that define leaders, but also their instincts going into those crises. I think that the two join together. Jürgen, let me turn to you, because the other side, other issues that Chancellor Merkel has been a true foreign policy leader for Germany and Europe has to be on the China relationship. And in some ways we saw the 15 years of work as a capstone with the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that came in the last days of the German presidency of the EU. Which ruffled some feathers here in Washington. The incoming Biden administration at that point had asked for consultation, slow down, let's talk about this. And there was clearly, strong movement to proceed. It was a negotiation 7 years in the making. How do you think Germany's economic relationship with China has changed or evolved under Angela Merkel? And then what will the future chancellor, how will it respond? It's not just an economic relationship, it's a climate relationship, it's a security relationship, particularly for the United States. Help us understand legacy and future. And then Majid, I'll ask you to reflect on that as well.
Let me first talk about China. I was in Beijing and other cities of China together with the Chancellor some years ago. And my impression, and she also saw it in the same way, my impression was that for China, Germany is a role model how to keep high quality and strong position on international markets, and in the same time also high level of income and of social security for the people. Because China tried to find a way to come back from this low cost end of the supply chain into the high quality products for the world market, where the price is not the only point where people decide to buy or not. And they were very much interested, or they are very much interested to see and to do it like Germany, to find a solution to fulfill the expectations of the people of growing welfare, and in the same time be strong on international markets. And this is why Germany is, from the Chinese perspective, Li Keqiang and Xi, from their perspective, Germany is, so to say, the #1 state they can learn of and cooperate with. Unfortunately, the situation with China and our assessment on Chinese politics changed in the last 10 years because I tell it smart imperialism, the combination of economic power and political power, to combine both, to use foreign investment to influence politics, to make states, for example, African states, bind it in their voting in United Nations General Assemblies or organizations of the United Nations and so on. This is something we cannot accept. And this is something that is new in this form in the last 10 years. President Xi is always smiling, but I think he's a very tough president of China, leader of the Communist Party of China, who has first time since hundreds of years that China tried to conquer the world, maybe not militarily, but with political pressure and economic power. And we have to face that. And I think the only chance to face it is to have a combined strategy with US or with North America, US, Canada. Therefore, I was so much in favor of TTIP, because TTIP would be a chance to combine 50% of the world market to face this challenge from China. From my point of view, the debate in Germany is much tougher on China. We have some sectors of the German industry that are very much depending on China. The income of the automobile industry in Germany, the highest profits they do in China, I think, especially Volkswagen. But we have to be aware that we should keep international regulation proper. And the investment agreement with China, it's founded in principle, but I think going into details is now the obligation of the European Commission together with other partners, U.S. for example. Our aim is to bind China into international regulation. This agreement could be a mosaic stone of that program, but it can also be a failure, and it's not yet finally decided where it walks. And I would appreciate to talk first to US and then to sign such an agreement. But 4 years, the last 4 years, nobody asked us to do anything, and therefore this was a normal European redaction. But it's not yet finalized, and therefore there will be a close communication between US and Europe on that field.
No, I think points are both taken. There's evolution, and there's an enormous amount of work that we have to do together as allies. Absolutely. Let me just add, I'm going to sort of segue you. I'd love your reflections on Germany's and the Chancellor's view on China. I'm sure you also probably took some trips on with foreign ministers and their interactions with Beijing. But then let's just turn in our last few minutes to the Biden administration and the future relationship, the United States and Germany and a new chancellor, and how to, in some ways, boy, I hate to use this word, reset that relationship, which has been very damaged. But quite frankly, there had a lot of scratchiness even that predated the Trump administration for sure. So help us understand what you're watching for a new government on China and Merkel's legacy, and then where do we go with the Biden administration?
So I think it was quite obvious that there was a loud sigh of relief after Biden's victory, even though it took longer for everyone to accept that he actually won the election. And if it weren't for the pandemic, Merkel would probably have been here January 21st, and so would the foreign minister and the defense minister and so on. So at the moment, it's kind of odd, like, look, we now have what we've all been waiting for, and nothing really happens because everybody is so focused on the crisis management and the pandemic and their own economic crises that you don't see an actual change. And I do think that once the pandemic is over, if you can say that at all, you will see the change. At the moment, it is quite clear that there is more important things to do than, international meetings and discussions about how many troops should remain in Afghanistan, and when Germany finally will live up to its promise to spend 2% of its GDP on defense spending and all that. The pandemic and the economic crisis are just dominating everything else. But you are right. I mean, in a way, Trump only put a spotlight on conflicts that had been there before. So there won't be a long honeymoon, and there won't be any yelling, and there won't be any cursing. So that will change. The tone will change, but in substance, there will still be conflicts. And Nord Stream, of course, being one of them. From an American point of view, there is the possibility of sanctions, which really puts Germany under pressure. The issue of NATO spending, of defense spending, will come back. But I think that the 4 years under Trump have changed the perception in Europe. I think they do realize that they have to do more for their own security, and they cannot rely on the US alone. And they know that even Biden is not in a position, even though he belongs to a generation that grew up with America being a European power. He knows, and relations will be close, but the transatlantic relations will change, and Biden will have to tell his European partners that they have to step up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the hardest thing, of separating the rhetoric and the destruction of credibility away from the substantive challenges that we'd actually have. In our last few minutes, and I first want to say the questions coming from the audience are amazing, and I'm not doing them justice. I wish we had 2 more hours to go through them, but I'm trying to grab them as I can and insert them into the conversation. But the last question I want to ask you both, starting with you, Jürgen, is what is the greatest threat to Germany today that you would say? I know there's a list of challenges that we're all facing, starting with the pandemic, but in the foreign and security policy, what is the greatest challenge? And then I'm going to ask you, how do you think Angela Merkel would address that challenge? How do you think the next German chancellor will address that challenge? So that's the last question. Jürgen, I'll start with you, and Maciej, I'll give you the last word.
I think the biggest threat is that it's very difficult to convince German citizens that we have to invest more in foreign and security policy, because the Germans, from her history and from their thinking, are a little bit. They hope that things might happen out around them and without them. And as we know, we are in the middle of the typhoon in sometimes. And the hardest work we all have to do, and I think this is not only my position as CDU-CSU spokesperson, but also colleagues from the Greens and Liberals or Social Democrats see it in the same way, that we have we have to prepare ground, that Germany has to take over more responsibility, what means more costs and also maybe more robust engagement. And concerning the fields where we have to act immediately to avoid a mid and long-term very negative development is our Africa politics. And I think we cannot expect that US is always doing our job in Africa where it needs to be, fighting against terrorism or establishing state structures and promoting good governance. I think this should be the role of the European Union in Africa. We have some very good examples where it works. The biggest German engagement abroad is not in Afghanistan at the moment, it's in Mali and Sahel region, and in other states of the Sahel region. And I think Europe as a whole has to do the job in Africa that 20 or 30 years ago a world would be expected from US, the world sheriff, so to say. I think this is, if we have success by establishing sustainable political and economic development in Africa, we do more for the sake of our children and grandchildren than in every other field of politics. This is my personal expectation. But unfortunately, there are a lot of other topics around.
I think the most challenging part is picking that one. But Maciej, I'm going to ask you, pick that one, the greatest threat for Germany. How would Chancellor Merkel respond? How would the future chancellor respond?
So I would say, on a more philosophical level, if you will, the greatest challenge is the perception of the end of the West, which was clearly virulent under Trump. And I think any notion that Europe could do it alone without the United States is overestimating its own capabilities, and a very dangerous spot, because there is no such thing as a neutral ground between the two power blocks, the United States and China, leaving aside Russia. I hope that Germany and Europe will still define itself as, being part of a Western project.
what was so fascinating about both your comments was it's very internally focused. It's convincing the German people of the challenges that lie ahead. It's a mindset that is still remains part of a West that is confident and that can meet these challenges. So I found in some ways we started at a full circle. It is really about those internal conversations that are so important. Well, thank you so much, Jürgen Hart, Nadja Sattar. You were amazing. Thank you for the great conversation. Again, to our audience, thank you for your incredibly thoughtful questions and comments and participating in this conversation with us. And then, of course, my great thanks to the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, Paul Lenars, and his wonderful colleagues for bringing this series to life. Remember, this is the first of a three-part series. We'll be bringing two other conversations that analyze Chancellor Merkel's legacy in the migration conversation and in austerity. So a preview of coming attractions. So thank you again for joining us. Be safe, be well, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.